All right, we'll move this so you can see me. And thank you, Alexis, and thank you all for coming on this freezing cold night. I thought Ohio was going to be hot. I remember like Illinois from summer vacations, and it was always hot. Anyway, this was a surprise. Gardening can be murder. So, I like to think I was predestined to be an author. This is me, age 2. I don't remember it, but I know it's South Pasadena, California, where the family lived at the time. My father got us a typewriter as a gift for the family. And they all tell me that I would not leave the typewriter. I just kept sitting there going, I type, I type, I type, which is about what I do now, except it's on a computer keyboard. So, before I became a gardener, which really didn't happen until I was in my 20s, I was a reader. I always loved to read. I came from a family of readers. I am the youngest of 4 children. The oldest, my brother Jerry, I started with his mysteries, and they were the Hardy Boys, right? So I worked through those. My 2 sisters in the middle, Pat and Kay. You know what I moved on to after the Hardy Boys. What was it? Nancy Drew, you bet. And these were the editions that I remember, those yellow and dark blue covers. Nancy Drew was interesting. And I wonder that I didn't grow up with some sort of inferiority complex, because the Nancy Drew stories, very deliberately, each one was about a different discipline. And in each discipline, Nancy Drew excelled. Very, very deliberate. It was, there's one for everyone, including, yes, the gardener. The gardener mystery in the Nancy Drew series is Password to Larkspur Lane. And Password to Larkspur Lane had an earlier, kind of edition. So this is the original edition that came out in the 1930s. I remember the edition that came out in the 1960s. Basically the same story. For some reason, in the 1960s, they dropped the word "the" from the title. So it went from The Password to Larkspur Lane to just Password to Larkspur Lane. Some editor made that decision, but basically the same story. In the story, Nancy Drew is growing larkspur or delphinium, and the story includes details, including where does the scientific name delphinium come from? Well, it's related to Apollo and the oracle at Delphi. When I reread this book, I thought, did I ever know this? I certainly didn't remember it. So Nancy enters her larkspur into a flower show, which is the scene you see illustrated here. I don't know if you can see, oops, sorry. Ooh, I've stopped. Sorry about that. There we go. We've caught up. Okay, I'm going to stop doing that. Usually I have my computer in front of me. I'm just going to turn around and look over my shoulder. All right, we've caught up. I'm wondering why there are these puzzled looks on all of your faces. Okay, so she's entered her larkspur into the flower show. If you can see it on the vase, it has a first prize. Of course, she has taken first place in the flower show, but then because it's a mystery, something sinister happens. This Doberman comes in, knocks over the flowers, growling, doesn't bite her, but Anyway, mysterious things happen. And she solves these various mysteries that have to do with a password. Now, who wrote Nancy Drew? You can see it right up here, right? Right, Carolyn Keene. That is the true mystery of the Nancy Drew series. As many of you probably know, but some of you may be horrified when I say this, because I had one person in an audience gasp when I told them there is no Carolyn Keene. She was like Betty Crocker. She was a made-up invention of a publishing company called the Stratemeyer Syndicate. They were located in Newark, New Jersey, and they cooked up these schemes, Edward Stratemeyer and then later his daughter Harriet, for series books for young people. Now we call them young adult fiction or YA fiction. So Carolyn Keene was written by, in many cases, Mildred Wirt, later Mildred Wirt Benson. She was an Iowan. She went to the University of Iowa. They hold her archives, but for decades, Mildred could not tell anyone contractually that she wrote as Carolyn Keene. That was broken in a lawsuit, and it turns out actually that Password to Larkspur Lane was not written by Mildred Wirt Benson, but by this fellow, Walter Carrig. I love the picture, right? You can tell it's of a certain time because there he is with the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. I love the little Siamese cat perching on his shoulder. Walter Carrig, if his name sounds familiar, it is probably because he wrote Victory at Sea. So he wrote a lot of those screenplays. So he's best known for that. And at least one Nancy Drew. This still happens, although now authors can tell people that they write as Carolyn Keene. So for example, Susan Wittig Albert, who's a very prolific mystery writer, has also written Nancy Drew stories as Carolyn Keene. So there you go. So I graduated from the family bookshelves to the library. And it's the library I still use because I still live in the town in New Jersey where I have lived since I was 2 years old. So, you know, I graduated to, I don't know, I started reading Phyllis A. Whitney. Anybody remember that name? People like that. There were others, and then of course Agatha Christie, and it went on from there. So I love libraries, and really this book could not have been written without libraries because I wrote it during that little pandemic when, well, we could still order books, and get them in the mail, but we had just amazing librarians who would still get us books from all around the system, leave them in little paper bags in the back hallway. Remember this? We'd sneak in with our masks on and grab our books. So I decided to write this book so that I wouldn't, commit murder myself or, because I got tired of trying to bake bread. And my garden looked better than it's ever looked, before or since. Okay. So I also want to tell you a bit about the illustrations, which you will see tonight, and they are just wonderful in the book. They are by my friend Yolanda Fundora. I think I called her, again, this is during lockdown, and said, do you have time to do illustrations for a book I'm cooking up? And she's an artist, she's a graphic designer, and she's a fabric designer. If any of you are quilters, you probably recognize what's behind her head. That is part of her stash of fabrics, but she designs fabrics as well as quilts. So she said, well, what do you have in mind? And I said, I need to do black and white because that's what the publisher has said, that's all we can afford. It's like, okay. I said that I liked Edward Gorey, right? If any of you watch the mystery series on PBS, now called Masterpiece Mystery, those funky little characters at the beginning are Edward Gorey. And if you're ever on Cape Cod, go to see his house. It's this very bizarre house museum, as you might imagine from his characters. I also said, when I was a kid, there was this magazine called Highlights for Children. My parents were very thrifty. We did not subscribe, but it made going to the doctor or dentist's office acceptable, in addition to those strips of sugar candy they used to give out. And every issue of Highlights had this Find the Hidden Pictures. It was a black and white image with all of these little funky things hidden around this complicated picture. So anyway, I tell Yolanda those two things, and the next day she emails me a sample with, how do you feel about this? And I said, you are an absolute genius. This is going to be great. So off we went from there. Now, this was my 6th book, and it was different than the others because it did not have a natural framework. So I have written about people like Emily Dickinson and Beatrix Potter. With those, I have written about their gardens and their lives, sort of seasonally. And that makes sense. I've written a book about the White House gardens. I wrote about, I started with George Washington. I moved to the most recent president. And, with this book, it was like, what am I going to use? So I used the structure of the detective novel as the skeleton, if you will, starting with, you've got to have a detective. It might be an amateur detective, it might be a professional detective, but you need a detective. And what I'll do for the remainder of the time is just give you a couple of examples from the book, from each of these chapters. So, gardening detectives. The earliest one I could find in the English language is in The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. How many of you have read this or seen a televised, version of it? Okay, a few. Wilkie Collins was a friend of Charles Dickens, so, put him in that time frame. This is not a murder mystery, but it is definitely a mystery. It borders on Gothic. Note, it's called, even on the cover, a romance. And it has a detective from Scotland Yard, named Sergeant Cuff. Sergeant Cuff loves roses. And he says right at the beginning of the book, maybe one of these days I shall, please God, retire from catching thieves and try my hand at growing roses. So roses are entwined in the entire novel, and they come up over and over again. So Sergeant Cuff, the first gardening detective in English. I gave you a preview of my next. Who's this? Who's this? Who's the character? Miss Marple, I hear it. This is Miss Marple, one of Agatha Christie's absolute favorite characters. I'd say Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot, they're kind of her two favorites. She started out in a short story in 1927. And when Agatha Christie introduces her, she introduces her with the term, if you'll pardon the expression, elderly, which we don't really use anymore. So later on, about 4 decades later, Christie said, I should have made her a schoolgirl when I started because she'd never be alive still. So she wrote about Miss Marple from 1927, and the last Miss Marple came out in 1976. As you can see, she has been portrayed by many, many actors, and some of them surprised me when I looked this up, especially Angela Lansbury, and who I associate with what mystery? Murder, She Wrote, right? She was in a million Murder, She Wrote. But yes, she played Miss Jane Marple in some made-for-TV movies. So you might have a favorite Miss Marple. I've argued about this with a good friend of mine, but just know, they basically all portray the same character. She is an unmarried woman living in that little English village. And I think the Miss Marple mysteries really set the tone for that kind of cozy English village mystery. Miss Marple was a gardener. She was also a bird watcher because you could be outside and sort of snoop on your neighbors without anyone really knowing. So she liked a garden. She grew flowers, not vegetables. She grew a few herbs, including her tansy to brew her grandmother's tansy tea. However, if I get invited to Miss Marple's garden, I want to go, after it's just a little bit in the afternoon where she might offer me some of her damson gin. Sounds much better to me than tansy tea. If you are just pining for new Miss Marple mysteries, I recommend this book, which in big letters says Agatha Christie Marple. When I saw this in a bookshop and bought it, I thought, oh, they found new Miss Marple mysteries. And in tiny letters, it shows you all of the different mystery writers that have written these 12 mysteries, certainly with the approval of the Christie estate. And interestingly, I had to get approval for every line quoted from Agatha Christie, from the Christie estate, before I could use it. Another one of my favorite gardening detectives is Brother Cadfael. If you haven't read these, I really recommend them. The writer, Ellis Peters, was very prolific in a short period of time. 21 books in 11 years. That is really quick. She also created this subgenre of the historic murder mystery. And Brother Cadfael is the herbalist, or I suppose they would say herbalist, for a Benedictine abbey in what I always read as Shrewsbury. They actually pronounce it as Shrewsbury. It was a real Benedictine abbey. They take place in the 12th century, a period called the Anarchy in British history, a very interesting period of British history, and they're quite accurate in that sense. I remember Cadfael from years and years ago. This was probably on in like the 80s, sounds like a long time ago now, where Derek Jacobi played Brother Cadfael. They also, I got them out of my library system so that I could rewatch them, and they're really fun. So good books and good TV series. So, scenes of the crime, right? You have to have a place where the crime is set. The gardens make a good place to dispose of a body. And so mystery writers have used gardens in various ways. Sometimes they are real gardens. Stephanie Barron wrote a book called The White Garden, which is set at Sissinghurst, which is a very famous garden in the south of England. Anyone been to Sissinghurst? I've been only once. It was raining, pouring, but it was still beautiful. Sissinghurst is the garden of Vida Sackville-West and her husband, Harold Nicholson. They were part of the Bloomsbury Circle, which was a really wild crowd. Vida was a friend and sometimes lover of Virginia Woolf. That is the outline of the face that you see on the cover of that book. And the White Garden is all tied up with the White Garden at Sissinghurst, and the death of Virginia Woolf, which, as you may recall, she loads her pockets up with stones and walks into the river and drowns. Okay, another real garden that appears in a mystery is in Agatha Christie's Halloween Party. If you saw the most recent Kenneth Branagh film, which was called Death in Venice, it was vaguely based on this novel, but only vaguely, because this novel has nothing to do with Venice. It does, however, describe an Irish garden in such detail that I was able to figure out what it was. It's a garden called Ilnacullen. You can see it's a beautiful Italianate garden. It's located on a little island in Bantry Bay, so off the coast of Ireland. I have never been there. Anyone been there? I'd love to go there someday. But The Halloween Party is one of the Christie novels that it has also a lot to do with gardening in general. It has to do with a rock garden specifically, and it is a Hercule Poirot mystery. A more recent novel that I loved was this one called Deacon King Kong. It's a very strange title. It's by James McBride. He most recently wrote The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, which I think has made a lot of, lot of reviews. Also a really good read. He's very good at writing characters. This is set in South Brooklyn in the projects in, I think, the late 60s, early 70s, and it has a lot to do both with gardening and foraging. And there is a particular plant that comes up that's prominent. Anyone grow this? This is moonflower. Yeah, I heard it. I see a couple hands. Moonflower. This is the evening equivalent of the morning glory. It is super easy to grow. There it is in my garden. You can grow it from seed. I just stick it in the ground, nick the seeds a little bit, like with a nail file before you plant them. And it blooms around 4 o'clock in the afternoon because it's night pollinated. So it's trying to attract moths and it's fragrant. So again, very pretty. All right. Can gardening make you want to kill someone? Absolutely, absolutely. I was saying to Alexis and Kate, today I had an enforced day off from gardening, which was great. I'm in a hotel out on the highway, and it's like, I think I'll take a nap, instead of going out there and digging. Okay, so garden murder mysteries that have motive for the garden. My number one pick is one called Deadheads. Deadheads by Reginald Hill. It starts out in a rose garden. It's all about a rose garden and this family, and the rose garden is both a motivation and drives the story. So this guy is trying to protect his rose garden, and anybody who's in the way suddenly dies. It's amazing. So this one I like a lot. You can also watch it on television. So it's one of these DL and Pasco mysteries. So, you can stream it now, or I'm sure you can get the DVD through the library. Another that I'll mention is a Ruth Ware. Do not read Ruth Ware when you're trying to go to sleep. This is an edge-of-the-seat kind of thriller. Turn of the key has to do with a poison garden. I actually asked her via email if it was related to a Hawthorne story called Rappaccini's Daughter, which is also about a poison garden. And she said, no, I was actually influenced by Turn of the Screw, which is a Henry James novella. So I went back and read the Henry James novella and went, oh yeah, okay, it really is all about that. So anyway, a poison garden, poisons have a lot to do with it. And she surprised me at the end. Every time she gets me. I'll read it to the end, I think I've got it, and then there's a little twist on the second to last page, and I go, she did it again. All right, I wanted to include noir, sort of this hard-boiled detective fiction. And so I thought, no orchids for Miss Blandish, that'll be perfect. The joke on me was there are no orchids in No Orchids for Miss Blandish, except on the cover, right? It's like Blue Dahlia, it's the same thing. It's not about the flower is just sort of a symbol. So much for that. The best I could do was The Big Sleep here, the movie version. This is a Raymond Chandler novel from 1939, probably most famous because of the Humphrey Bogart movie. And really, it's not about gardening. There's just one scene that is in the Sternwood mansion. It's in the greenhouse, and it has this very grim description of orchids and life in general. So much for hard-boiled. Okay, then murder weapons. I know, I love this illustration. This is like everything in my garage, which is also my garden shed, which how you could kill someone. All those sharp instruments, you name it. So, this was a Christmas gift from my husband one year, and I had never seen one of these. So imagine it's under the tree, I unwrap it and I pull it out. It's like, wow, this is like really a weapon. Now, I think most people know it's a Japanese soil knife. It's really good for weeding, but it is really sharp. And again, lots of sharp things. This whole project was inspired by this book. Anne Ripley is may she rest in peace. She's an American author. She was from Colorado, and she was a garden writer before she started writing mysteries. And so this was her first. It was called Mulch. In the story, she makes her protagonist a garden writer, right? You write what you know. And she has her move to a new house in a new neighborhood, and she decides she wants to mulch with fallen leaves. Now, I don't know if this is true in Hudson. In the fall, people bag their leaves in paper bags and put them out by the curb, and the town picks them up for the compost. In the story, she goes out to collect other people's leaves because her property is too tidy. And in some of them, they find some surprises. Body parts, yes. So, it's a little gruesome in parts, but it does have a lot about plants as well. And anyway, this is what made me think, I bet there are a lot of mysteries that have to do with gardening. Then we have weed killer. So it's a great favorite all through the history of the mystery as a garden-related weapon. So if you need a break from gruesome mysteries and thrillers, read an Agatha Raisin. They are, a bit of fluff. They're great fun. Or again, you can watch the series, which same thing. They are a lot of fun. The Potted Gardener is about gardening. It does include weed killer, as many of them do. And it's a funny book because Agatha is trying to win the town, the village most beautiful garden contest, and she puts up a big fence and has somebody come in and try to do an overnight garden. It never works out for Agatha, but everything's okay in the end. And then, of course, there are poisons. Right? There are quite a number of books about poisons, and that is one thing my editor said. You must do more than just poisons, because there are books out there about that. But I had to include a few of my favorites. So who grows this? Anybody? Yeah, foxglove. I love foxglove. Digitalis purpurea. If you take a little bit, it can help your heart. If you take too much, you're dead. Obviously it has gotten used in all sorts of mysteries. I love this series. It's by a Canadian named Alan Bradley. Its protagonist at the beginning, in the very first book, this is book number 2, she's 11 years old, she's a chemistry whiz. And in this book, number 2 in the series, she actually describes how to extract digitalin from foxglove in your home chemistry lab. So, don't try this at home. She also does things like she laces her sister's lip balm with poison ivy extract. She's a little naughty, old Flavia is, but they are also a lot of fun. There is foxglove in my garden. It's not in the same place every year. It moves around because that's just the way I garden. You plant yourself where you want, and that's where you grow. Right now, they're starting to kind of go over, but you have to let the seed pods develop, or you won't get them next year because it's a biennial. How many of you grow rhubarb? I love my rhubarb, right? It's waiting for my next picking when I get home. What part do you eat? Yeah, just the stems, right? You don't eat the leaves. The leaves are high in oxalic acid, or oxalics, whatever they are. There they are, all cut up. But Naomi Hirahara, a wonderful writer, she's a journalist. She also does a lot of history. She used them in one of her series, which stars a protagonist that she based after her father. The name of the protagonist is Mas Arai. He's a Japanese-American in Southern California. This book talks all about the strawberry industry. My recommendation is you don't eat the pie. And then clues, right? You can't have a mystery without clues because it's all about trying to put them together, right? You're working against the author, or at least with the author. So this rose is a clue in an Agatha Christie mystery called Sad Cypress. Sad Cypress is another Hercule Poirot mystery. And this rose, there it is in my garden, called Zéphirine Drouhin. I see some nods. This is my favorite rose to prune. Why? Why is it my favorite to prune? Thornless rose. It's a historic rose without thorns. Very fragrant, very beautiful, only blooms once a year, but worth the wait. And there's Hercule himself. And then we have a plant that you wouldn't want to grow in your garden. This one is called caltrop, or puncture vine, because of its seeds. And you can see these vibram soles where the seeds are actually stuck in. This is more of a desert plant. Even the scientific name sounds evil, Tribulus terrestris, right? It sounds like some, Harry Potter curse. And it appears in Tony Hillerman's The Wailing Wind as a clue to where the murder actually took place. So again, it has to do with ethnobotany and, the knowledge of where plants grow. I got very interested in the word caltrop because I had never heard that before. And this is, welcome to my world. I love to research. So I go look up caltrop. Well, this is a caltrop from a museum. It's actually a Roman weapon. So the ancient Romans would create hundreds or thousands of these little sharp metal spiky things and throw them out in front of oncoming armies. So you can imagine with people on foot or on horseback, the damage those would do. So that's a little awful, but that's where caltrop comes from. And then, it's not always the butler, right? Sometimes the gardener is the suspect. Including in Death in the Garden. I really recommend this book. It's an author I had never heard of named Elizabeth Ironside. It's a British mystery that is a kind of flashback mystery and quite well written. Elizabeth Ironside actually is a pen name for Lady Catherine Manning. She was the wife of the British ambassador to the United States when she wrote this book. What a place for a book launch, right? Let's do it at the British Embassy. But it's a great read. Nio Marsh, another one of those, sort of queens of crime fiction back in the day. She was from New Zealand. She spent a lot of time in England as well. She was very involved in the theater. And in the book, Grave Mistake, the gardener is also a suspect, and it also has a lot to do with the theater, so that's interesting too. And then finally, I'll just close. I love to write about authors and their gardens. That's been sort of my mainstay all the way through my writing over the past, 2+ decades. And so I wrote about some writers who garden, like Agatha Christie, who gardened and wrote a lot, as you can see from her stack of books. There she is at her beloved country home, which she bought with her second husband, Max Malone. It is in South Devon, not too far from Exeter, and it overlooks a river. She loved this house. It was very close to where she had grown up. It came with a collection of rhododendron and camellia, which she and her husband added to. It's now a property of the National Trust. So this is also on my list of places I'd like to go. Any National Trust property has two wonderful things, a tea shop and a great gift shop. So you can do that. Or again, you can see this property in this episode of the old Hercule Poirot series with David Suchet. It's in the very last episode that David Suchet was in. That is a picture of the DVD case that I got out of my library, so I know you can find it. But it's called Dead Man's Folly, and it was filmed at Greenway, at Christie's country home. So that's fun. Rex Stout, any of you remember him? Yeah, Rex Stout. Really prolific, really interesting character. Read about him on Wikipedia if you don't buy my book. He was a polymath. I think he was something of a genius. He did all sorts of things in his life, including he was in the Navy on the crew for Theodore Roosevelt's yacht. How about that? But he wrote so many mysteries. He said it would take him 6 weeks to write a mystery. Wrote like 40 Nero Wolfe mysteries, 6 weeks. It takes me 3 years. Nero Wolfe, he was corpulent, I'll say. And he was reclusive. He ran his private investigating firm to support his habits. He loved to eat, so he had a chef. He loved his orchids, so he had the top, kind of penthouse of his New York brownstone done up in greenhouses, and he had a full-time orchid guy live with him. He and his sidekick were also made into many TV series and movies, and Archie was sort of his, he was his Dr. Watson, if you will. And lots of orchids. If you love orchids, there are something like 400 different named orchids in the Nero Wolfe canon, if you will. Again, played by many, many people, Archie and Nero including, do you recognize him? Yeah, I think of him as Captain Kirk, but he was also Archie Goodwin, William Shatner. Okay, and there's Rex Stout with his houseplants. He had hundreds of houseplants. I don't know how he took care of his houseplants and wrote all those books. I can barely keep up with 20 houseplants. He had several hundred. He also had a really amazing collection of tall bearded irises. His garden was in Danbury, Connecticut. I don't think there's anything left of the garden, but he was in several articles about tall bearded irises and started judging them. His sister was Ruth Stout, who was very famous for mulch back in the day. So she was a garden writer as well. And then I'll finish with Cynthia Riggs, who a bookstore owner said, you've got to include Cynthia Riggs. She's got a great story. Her books are all about plants, and she writes about Martha's Vineyard, so that island off the coast of Cape Cod. And Cynthia's story is, when she was in her 60s, she decided to get an MFA in creative writing. And then she decided she'd write a mystery series with 20 books. And she's up to number 14, which I think is pretty great. I didn't ask her age. She is a 16th generation vineyarder. And she made her detective 90 plus years old. And she said, I based it on my mother, who could have done all of those things. My mother lived to be 99 years old. And, so I thought Victoria Trumbull could too. Anyway, you can go to her house, which she now has as a B&B. And I had to include a New Yorker cartoon. I don't know if you can read the bottom, but it says, did you remember to bring my gardening gloves? And two guys are out. I will tell you where they are. They're in the New Jersey Meadowlands. The New Yorker, all New York people poke fun at New Jersey. And they are burying the body out there. So there are many, many murder mysteries to read. I'm sure this wonderful library has a huge section of them, but be careful how many you consume, or your garden may end up looking like mine. Thank you very much. Who recognizes the plant in the picture? The big one, castor bean. Can I tell you a true crime story? Okay, so I decided to write this book. I let the people in my garden club know about it. And one of the club members, who now lives in New England, she's moved to a retirement community. She called me up out of the blue, and she said, can I tell you a story? It's going to take 10 or 15 minutes. I said, sure. And she said, well, I moved in this community. It's really nice. But all of a sudden, there was this rash of people having to go to the hospital. They'd call the ambulance, bring them to the hospital with severe gastric problems. And one of the doctors at the hospital got a little suspicious and did some tests, and then called the local police department and said, I've found traces of ricin in these samples that I've tested. Ricin is from castor bean, which it's Ricinus communis. Ricin is also, do you remember Georgi something in London got poisoned with the tip of an umbrella by, they think, a Russian spy with ricin? Okay, so how did this happen? Well, around the community, there were these big, luscious plants grown as annuals, right? They get really big. They have a huge seed, you plant them, and in one season, they'll get this tall, be full of these tropical leaves and these funky blooms. Well, a woman in the community had read an article about castor bean and their poison qualities. And she decided that she would pick some seeds and grate them up. I imagine her with like a microplane. Grate them up, and she peeled open, I guess, like, Nespresso or Keurigs, those coffee pods, and put like a little dash in each one, and then sealed them up and started giving them out to her neighbors. Because she wanted to see what would happen. And I checked, like it was in the papers. And she's now living in a different sort of community. Anyway, I didn't put it in the book because I thought, well, it's not the fault of this retirement community that this woman lived there. Anyway, but it wasn't about true crime, so. Any questions or any suggestions for a series that you love that I didn't talk about tonight? We're just waiting for a cookie. I know we have cookies back there. I will tell you that I have there is a list in the back of the book of the 100 or so mysteries that I read in order to write this book. This book, I will say, was strangely crowdsourced because as I told people, I was doing a lot of Zoom talks at the time, so I would tell people, this is what I'm working on next. People would, out of the blue, they'd send me their list of favorite gardening murder mysteries. And so that was really fun, and people still do. So I have it up on my website as well, so you can find the whole list. And if you have any ideas, just email me. Anybody? Are you all shy? I can't believe people in Hudson, Ohio are shy. Yes. Oh, are you a plant? My favorite question. So I am back to Beatrix Potter. I wrote a book about Beatrix Potter called Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life. I will confess, I did not read Beatrix Potter as a child. I read Little Peter Cottontail. I read The Velveteen Rabbit. I didn't read Beatrix Potter until I was an adult. But that book has outsold the other 5 books combined. She's very popular. So I'm back to Beatrix Potter, who was also a super interesting person to research, and writing a book about her plants because she did loads and loads of flower paintings. And I couldn't use them all in my first book, and I thought, hey, if Marvel Studios can do 1 million repeats of the same thing, so come on. And it's a lot of fun, because I got to go back to England. Anybody else? Thank you all for coming. Enjoy your evening.